We are inclined to assume that problems such as epidemical disease have been more or less solved by our modern way of life, and also that we have at least come to a reasonable solution of their causes. Actually, however, when you start examining the literature of the subject, you find there is far less certainty than might be supposed. On nearly all basic problems of human health, we are still in a highly speculative condition. We observe, note, classify, prepare various remedies, but perhaps it is true that we have not found the real cause for a great many conditions for which we have now found some remedies. And the great basic problems of health have not yet come under our full understanding. Also, it is a mistake to believe that most of the research on these matters is recent. There is a very long story behind man's struggle for health, and a great part of the basic work was done 1,000 or 2,000 years ago. This we have a tendency to conveniently overlook, becoming so fascinated with the immediate and the imminent that we lose sight of the great background of pioneering that has been accomplished. When we go back to the clinics of Hippocrates, about the 3rd century BC, we find that health problems were already under careful consideration. And the texts left to us by Hippocrates and his associates show a tremendous degree of original insight and a careful classification of known facts. This was not a period entirely of philosophic medicine, because Hippocrates was by nature an observationalist. He believed in watching and reporting faithfully only those things seen. He believed in studying remedies and reporting faithfully only the actual results which they attained. So by degrees, a considerable body of information was accumulated. Even in those days, epidemics of various kinds, plagues and pestilences, have been reported. The Egyptians suffered from them, so did the Greeks, and of course they were comparatively frequent in Asia. These problems led to an effort to analyze the cause for certain waves of health or sickness, and also to study the basic root pattern of sickness itself. That certain types of sickness classify together, that human ailments break into a certain number of basic ailments, that these in turn divide into those by means of which remedy arises from the disease itself as immunity, or which runs its course and then departs regardless of outside assistance. The second type of ailment is that which must be worked with, by which the patient is served or helped through a specific group of remedies, and will not normally improve unless those remedies are applied. The third group may be regarded as such as almost inevitably lead to a fatal result. Under some conditions, however, there are evidences that the most fatal maladies can be corrected or sometimes cease of themselves. There are known, for example, arrested cases of leprosy that have not been arrested by medical skill, but the disease has simply ceased within its own structure for no known reason. The same is true of cancer, tuberculosis, diabetes, and many other of our most difficult forms of disease. These occasionally disappear of themselves from the patient, although such an occurrence may be considered rare. Still, if it occurs at all, it must be considered and examined. Also, we note by the study of various health programs that certain ailments increase under certain conditions, that there may be long periods in which a disease is comparatively unknown. Then it will suddenly burst forth again. And this is as true of non-contagious or non-infectious diseases as any other kind. There are also many epidemics in which there is no possible way of assuming that the disease is merely transferred from one person to another. Also, in cases of highly epidemical diseases, the course of the ailment through a country, through a community, through a broad social strata is as eccentric as the course of an earthquake. There are cases of earthquakes in which a very serious seismic disturbance divides the two sides of the street of a single town, demolishing everything on one side and leaving the other side untouched. Not long ago, there was an earthquake in one of the Latin American countries in which this was a peculiar circumstance. The houses on one side of the street were completely wrecked, whereas on the opposite side of the street, not even a dish was shaken from a rack. This situation is so remarkable that it forces us to recognize that earthquakes follow laws, that there are rules, that there are magnetic fields and courses involving what we sometimes refer to as an earthquake fault. Research, however, proves that epidemic disease may have something a little in common with earthquakes, because such an epidemic, as we have noted, for example, in an outbreak of the Black Death in Europe, in which perhaps 10, 15, or 20 million persons perished within a few weeks, such a disaster takes on almost the coloring of a terrible earthquake striking a city or area. Consideration has now shown that the term earthquake is a definition of an effect rather than of the cause. That almost certainly earthquakes begin not in the earth but in the air. And the same thought has been applied to sickness. And as early as Hippocrates, it was the opinion of many ancient scholars from their own personal investigation that epidemical diseases do not arise within peoples primarily. They do not come as the direct result of one infection or one case of a communicable disease. They seem to arise in the air, sweep over areas, and are carried into the most remote parts of an area where you would appear to be free from the probability of either contagion or infection. The research on earthquakes was carried on in many areas, but perhaps outstandingly in Japan, where it is not unusual to average from 12 to 1,500 earthquakes a year. With such a tremendous laboratory of available clinical material, the Japanese have done a great deal with it. Among their earliest observations was the effect of earthquakes on magnets. And at Yedo, which is the old name for Tokyo, the experiment was more or less focused by an occurrence in the shop of a watchmaker. He kept his small watch parts on magnets in order that the little bolts and screws and wheels might not be lost. Suddenly one day as he was working, all his magnets discharged. The little pieces all fell onto his workbenches like snow. He was very much astonished and could not imagine what had happened, and a few minutes later a terrific earthquake hit. As a result of this and a number of other experiments, the Japanese developed their earthquake alarm, which consists of an iron ball held on a magnet and suspended over a broad flat metal surface. When the time comes when an earthquake is imminent, the ball suddenly drops from the magnet, strikes the metal with a clanging sound, and everyone heads for the bamboo groves. And it almost infallibly works. Now that this magnetism, or this electricity, has some peculiar effect, is also taken from the experiments and observations in South America, where it is discovered, for example, that fish suddenly die in mass, and a few minutes later there is an earthquake, or within 24 hours. Also that animals grazing in a certain area will suddenly leave that area for no known reason, and that area is then involved in an earthquake. Now it might be nice to assume that the animal is psychic, or that the fish wish to commit suicide, but at the same time, this is most unlikely. The actual fact is that there is some kind of a marked atmospheric change, and that this atmospheric change is poisonous to the fish, or in some way warns the animal away from an endangered area. When a strip of coast fell into the sea in Peru, it had been for a long time the grazing ground for wild horses. There were thousands of them on it, and many, many thousands right on the piece that fell into the sea. But when it fell into the sea, not one horse was lost. They had all left, which perhaps is the origin of our common term, horse sense. They had some kind of an ability to foreknow this particular problem. We know the old farmers' experiences. We know how thunderstorms affect eggs and milk, and we have quite a long record of the relationship between atmospheric phenomena and physical circumstances. We also know that in many places where poultrymen function, an earthquake will almost certainly destroy a complete hatchery of eggs as far as bringing the eggs into life is concerned. Thus, there have a series of interrelated circumstances, and these circumstances have suggested for a long time that we look for other causes than those generally recognized for certain rather familiar circumstances. We have a reason to assume, then, that many phenomena which we now regard as physical are actually electrical or magnetic, and that disturbances in the atmosphere of the earth, affecting particularly the heaviside layer of the atmosphere, may very well result in peculiar and extraordinary physical conditions. This might be regarded at first as mere theorizing, but it is supported by a great many facts which can be assembled if we want to study them. We also realize that primitive people and older peoples have this same, perhaps rather strange faculty of sensing things that maybe is associated with the horses that left the endangered area. Certain knowledge value does not come from intellectualism. It comes from a rapport with universal facts. And most primitive creatures seem to have more of this than man has, whose artificial culture has led him very far from direct contact with living value. For this reason, the Greeks and the Egyptians, these being particularly epidemic-laden peoples, with some basic scientific or integrational way of preserving records, and therefore we are able to examine their reports to some measure, they all believed that in some way epidemical disease was an atmospheric problem. On the other hand, the Greeks were among the first to speculate upon the possibility that a disease was actually a minute organism. The Greeks did not overlook the idea of germs. And probably as early as the time of Socrates, they had already a strong school of speculative thought dealing with the possibility that minute living organisms were responsible for the transmission of certain ailments. Early records of theirs relating to the germ theory are most interesting, for they were very close to the facts as we believe them or affirm them today. The main difference being that they did not use quite as scientific a group of words to explain those facts, but they simply did believe that a very minute organism might be responsible, and that this organism could be transferred from person to person, or could exist in the air as a spore, and would therefore be communicated to one person from another, either by physical contact or by respiration. These points were already under consideration. The Greeks, however, were not inclined to completely accept this, because they also were searching for the cause of this particular phenomenon. Assuming that germs, or a virus of some kind, or bacteria, were responsible for this condition, then it must be assumed that such germs or bacteria had an eternal existence somewhere, or else that they were generated in some way. And if like generates like, the seed or root of the ailment must be everywhere present. So Hippocrates came to the conclusion, and later Galen, the Roman physician, supported him, to the effect that these germs had to exist either in one of two places or in both of them. One was the grand collective area outside of man, in his environment, and the other was within man himself. That these dangerous organisms were either of perpetual existence, or else they were strangely and wonderfully generated in some way. Now, the Greeks were already interested in sanitation, which has since become one of our most dominant explanations for sickness. The Greeks assumed the possibility that your so-called bacterial organism might arise from decomposition. Therefore, that wherever decay was permitted to go unchecked, wherever hygiene was neglected, wherever there were swamps which were not drained, stagnant areas of water, refuse piles, the natural rubbish of human life, wherever there was inadequate sanitation, in these areas it was quite conceivable that some form of microorganism could be generated, or that this organism already existing might be released. Or still again, a suspicion which we have never done much with, but perhaps does have some point in it, namely that the natural organisms of decomposing bodies, under the process of decomposition, might be themselves infected and changed from benevolent things to malevolent ones. Therefore, as a mosquito may carry a dangerous ailment, or the tsetse fly can be responsible for the Trypanosome gambiense reaching man and giving him sleeping sickness, so in some way the emanations from decomposition, the process of cell life breaking down, may result in the release of a mass of destructive cells, or cells made toxic and destructive by the processes of decomposition. In one way or another, then, the ancients came to the conclusion that one of several answers had to be. One of these answers was that this trouble rose from humans' lack of sanitation, overpopulation, malnutrition, and other situations by means of which the natural resistances of man were undermined, and at the same time he was remarkably exposed to dangerous infections. The second possibility being that these organisms were in man at all times, but under certain conditions of living were more likely to increase and multiply than under other conditions of living. Thirdly, that they were carried by the atmosphere and were created as spores within space itself by a series of peculiar circumstances which we will describe. Or else that such organisms as might be responsible were in themselves waves of life, and as one nation declares war upon another, so at certain times these waves of malicious life declare war upon healthy life and lock themselves in a great struggle. For some reason, of course, it was difficult to determine when these epidemics would come, and it was also difficult to determine when they would depart. Even today, we have to face the simple fact that the measles, or chicken pox, or scarlatina, or whooping cough, these suddenly become epidemical. This epidemic, we note also to generally fall within seasonal patterns. We also observe that in some cases the epidemic is far more serious than in other cases. And this is true of other problems. I was on an army camp in which infantile paralysis broke out. There were about 20 cases among the children of officers. None of the children were even hospitalized. The attack was so mild, consisting principally of a slight stomach disorder and perhaps a day or so of light fever. And that was all there was to it. On another occasion, a similar epidemic would strike with deadliness, and most of those children would have been either hopelessly crippled or killed. Of course, I'm referring to conditions that existed prior to the development of the recent anti-polio vaccine. On the other hand, we find interesting situations. There was a very terrible epidemic of smallpox a number of years after the development of the smallpox vaccine. This epidemic was much worse than a parallel case occurring before the discovery of the vaccine. And the situation after the development of the polio vaccine is also not clear. In one area, I noted from records that the attacks of polio were almost doubled in the 2 years following the use of the vaccine. In other areas, it is reported that the polio almost disappeared. So we are in again a matter of very unsettled knowledge about these kind of problems. The next point that we want to make out, for example, is to take one of these ailments and just try to trace some of the story of it, because I think many of these points are of value. We'll bring in other details as we proceed. For example, we all suffer almost annually from a rather nebulous kind of ailment, which is most debilitating, most inconvenient, and in those otherwise not well, sometimes very dangerous. And that is what we call influenza. Influenza seems to be the scholastic title for the old ailment which we call the grip. And this in turn has been mixed into the problem of the severe cold until sometimes it is difficult to distinguish them. The word influenza apparently came from Italy and means exactly what it may sound like it meant. It means influence. The influenza was named in honor of the idea that the planets cause sickness, for the word means the influence of the stars upon health. This ailment was early associated with astronomical phenomena, and its long and difficult course has several lessons in it that are important to us. It is one of the ailments, for example, that is no respecter, as far as we can find out, of hygiene. It attacks almost every level of society. There is comparatively little immunity to it, and at the same time there are a large number of persons that never have it. Influenza, unlike many of the other general contagious or infectious ailments, is not limited to children. It strikes in any part of living. It strikes at many seasons of the year, and it has various degrees of severity. Some epidemics are comparatively light, some are very heavy. There are many forms of influenza within the general pattern itself, and certain types are considered to be seriously dangerous. Now, the course of this ailment in recorded history, which has been more or less kept with the ailment under one of its several names for the last 300 or 400 years, shows that it breaks through practically every reasonable theory that we have. After, however, a certain length of time, the ailment or the epidemic simply dies out. Now, why should it die, leaving behind it a large number of healthy prospects, most of whom could get it? How is it that it will go through a certain area, leaving maybe 3/4 of the population unaffected, and then simply die out? It cannot be because, like a fire, it has destroyed all its fuel. There is much more fuel, and there is another large availability across some border somewhere in another region. Yet the ailment seemingly ceases. Now, in recent times, we like to believe that it is due to the heroic services of our physicians and our science researchers. And to a measure, it probably is. But most of their remedies are to help us to recover. And we have no way of saying that these remedies actually terminate the life of the disease. Let's take an Asiatic situation, for example. Cholera striking an area. Cholera striking some highly congested Asiatic area may take 1 million, 2 million, 5 million persons. And then it dies. We don't have cholera for the moment. Now, what kills it? Some feel that the thing that destroys it is change of season, that this ailment only incubates in certain climatic periods. We cannot possibly say that in some eastern country it is due to the valiant struggle of the physician, for it is unlikely that the doctor is able to treat 1 out of 1,000 cases. Also in this country, when we have an influenza epidemic, a great many people do not take treatment for it other than some local cold remedy. They sputter their way through it, fully realizing that in 2 or 3 weeks it'll probably clear up. Does the total run of the ailment also have a time pattern of this kind? Does the ailment have within it the capacity of only enduring for a certain time? We have this entity, which we can almost call a being. The ancients almost always personified the plague as some kind of a monster. This being is born some way, lives for a certain time, and dies without any known cause. Having died, it will remain dead for a long time sometimes, perhaps even for centuries, and then will suddenly come to life again, with all its original violence, or perhaps a less degree of violence. Nothing seems to be available to give us a clear insight into this situation. At the time of the influenza in Europe, the French and the Italian physicians were still under the old way of thinking. They mixed their science with a considerable amount of miraculous speculation, and they tried to work out what they felt to be some explanation, some reason. The influenza was so very difficult at that time that the physician found absolutely no way to immunize himself. and in the majority of instances, he was as sick as his patients. Nursing was almost impossible because the nurse immediately contracted it. The whole situation then required some rationalization, and these older physicians tried to understand the best they could. Of course, during this same period of time, there was also another broad explanation that wasn't entirely satisfactory, but did meet the needs of certain classes of people, and that is that all such ailments were divinely sent. That it was the punishment of deity, that the Lord was the bestower, and that the Lord finally took the ailment away after he had felt that his children were properly chastised. Even in the Middle Ages, however, the physicians would not quite accept that in toto, although they undoubtedly had a number of patients whom they realized deserved punishment of some kind. It was more, therefore, an effort to reconcile this idea that the pestilence or the disease might be heaven sent, that they began to scan the heavens more carefully. And they came to the conclusion that it was quite possible that in a way heaven did bestow, not because of the desire of any deity to punish, but simply because the elements were present in space itself, by means of which most of these mysteries could be explained. So with their then interest in borderline problems of knowledge, they approached the matter in terms of astrology. Perhaps more correctly, in terms of astrometeorology, which is a highly specialized field. It is the field of the effort to determine the effect of planetary position and motion upon the atmosphere in terms of weather, climate, and earthquakes. Most persons of the older generation remember the old family almanac that used to be given out in the drugstore. It was usually tied up with some ancient and honorable remedy, such as Jane's vermifuge, and consisted partly of advertising and partly of important notes and news. One of the earliest forms of this type of almanac in the United States was created and distributed by Benjamin Franklin, his famous Poor Richard's Almanac. In this almanac, the farmer found reports about the weather, suggestions for planting, suggestions for the type of crop that would be most likely to be successful, warnings about late frosts and early thaws, also the probabilities of heavy storms in his area. And the old farmer always kept that almanac close to hand. It was one of the few books read in the family, for the family usually would consist of the group and a limited literature, probably the Bible, Bunyan's Pilgrim's Progress, a couple of the works of Dickens, and the Almanac. This constituted literature. In this case, the Almanac was used year after year, and we cannot suppose that this farmer, a shrewd, earthy man, with the problem of survival involved in the success of his crops, that this man would have watched this almanac, followed its instructions, and approved of it for the most of the years of his life, had it not been reasonably accurate. He was in a position to know, and the first time there was a serious difference, he would be suspicious, and by the third time he would tear up the almanac. But he did not tear it up. He kept it with him, because he found that in the majority of instances it was correct. This was prediction concerning weather, based upon long-range study of the mutual relationships of planets during the year. Many rather serious and scholarly texts have been compiled bearing upon this, and modern research does not overthrow it, although it does not like to make too much of the issue at the present time. We know that under certain conditions, the planetary positions affect weather, So our physicians back in the Middle Ages and in the early modern world began to consider the relationship between weather and disease. They were trying to find whether or not it was true that certain positions of planetary bodies and their aspects could be responsible for stirring up a weather situation, which in turn had to be a kind of electrical or magnetic phenomena. If these planets affected the Earth, they certainly did not affect physically or literally, but they affected through the pull of gravity. They affected through some influence upon the Earth's atmosphere. Now, if this influence really existed, if there was some explanation that the pull of the moon was responsible for the tide, which we never seem to have been able to recover from, that this pull represented some kind of energy, and that this energy, moving in space, could come into various patterns, some violent, some benevolent, some indifferent, that certain of these relationships would cause high winds, another relationship a very early and severe winter, still other relationships an early and pleasant spring, and that these relationships and their consequences in turn could have remarkable effects upon human affairs. For example, if the researcher observed a very mild spring following a severe winter, he came to an almost inevitable conclusion, namely that individuals had better begin sandbagging their dikes and prepare for spring floods, for they would come. The snow would melt too rapidly. But today, with our broad, deep knowledge of these things, we continue to neglect the dikes and have floods every year to everyone's total amazement. They're just about as astonishing as the situation on Mount Etna in Sicily, where every time the lava flow ceases, the vineyard grower puts his house back in the lava track and then wonders why it is washed away next time. There seems to be no explanation for these things, except man's total inability to learn from experience. If then it is true that there can be a reputable way of foretelling weather, if climate, particularly that part which is related to the vicissitudes of temperature, wind, and the like, can be predicted a year in advance, as the old farmer certainly believed with his almanac, then we are in the presence of a diagnosable state of affairs. A state of affairs which means that the atmospheric world around us is continually changing, and that this constant and consistent atmospheric change may be responsible not only for the flood that washes away our house, but for another kind of flood, like pneumonia, that may attack our living structure. This, again, does not tell us how pneumonia originates, but it does tell us this, that in the atmosphere there may be conditions and times in which atmospheric circumstances contribute more to epidemical disease than at other times. That there are times when perhaps the total atmosphere of the earth, like the human being's personal resistance to infection, may be lowered in its resistance factor. It is quite possible that certain vital energies which are needed to purify the earth's atmosphere may not be as abundant at one time as another. Therefore, that the disinfecting or sterilizing power of air may not be as sufficient under certain conditions as it is under other conditions. The French school and the Italian school then approached the problem of sanitation head on and began to combine it with their opinions concerning the atmospheric cause of the prevalence of a certain epidemical ailment. For example, when Nostradamus was made town physician to a small French community, the first thing he tried to do was to get a certain swamp drained. This swamp was a danger, he felt, to the life and health of the people. It was near the edge of the village, and when the wind was right, these fumes came into the town in much in the same way that the old Chicago dweller knows what happens when the wind blows over the stockyards. It was a very unpleasant situation, and he felt a dangerous one. He appealed to the city fathers. He did everything he could, but he found complete indifference. Not necessarily because it was believed that the swamp was there by divine right, but that the consequences of it were under divine guidance. And therefore, that if you had the epidemic that year, there was nothing you could do about it. It was the will of God. So as Nostradamus points out, when he finally left the community, refusing to be physician there any longer, it was impossible for him to fight the inertia of the people concerning the needs of health. Other communities, however, were somewhat more successful. And the idea gradually generated, based upon Roman, Arabic, and Greek original research, that the time had come, and it is certainly more than due now, to make a very careful study of what might be termed the sterilizing power of air. To the Egyptians and Greeks, the air was another kind of water. Thales declared that the earth was a ship floating on an ocean of air, and that earthquakes were caused by someone rocking the boat. But regardless of this, he would have been the first to declare that it was the air and not the boat, or the so-called water beneath it, that caused the boat to rock. It was not the ship rocking upon a smooth sea. Therefore, what appears to be communicated from the center may be the result of a pressure from the circumference. Studying this matter, the opinion finally came that the atmosphere of the earth is a strange absorbing medium which contains into itself and gradually purifies by its own chemistry, plus the light of the sun, and perhaps the effects of other planets, which may constitute a sterilizing agency, that this atmospheric pollution was gradually dissolved as though it had been breathed out into clear air, like the exhalation of the human breath. That this dissolving of poisons had to go on continuously, because everywhere in nature, from one end to the other, there is life and death. Every moment things are dying and are being gradually destroyed by decay. And from the earth's surface, a continual mass of noxious vapors or fumes constantly arise. And that this mass of residue, this excrement from the planet itself, has to be cleansed by the air. A certain degree of this cleansing is more immediately done by water itself, and our sewage and our refuge generally goes to the sea. And the sea continues to receive it. But constantly the chemistry between the sea and the sun, the raising up of water in a process of perpetual distillation, is again the cleaning agent, according to the observations of our medieval scientists. Thus, everything that is corrupt, everything that is dead, everything that is dangerous to life, must ultimately be cleansed by nature's own processes. Now, at this time, man may be able to take over some part of this, particularly such refuse as belongs to his own kind. But still, if man would solve this problem completely, from the jungle, from the swamp, from the earth's surface everywhere, from the leaves of grass dying on your front lawn, there must forever be death and its processes causing things to be cast into the atmosphere. And this atmosphere then has to become a tremendous sewerage system with its own plan for the transformation of this waste into new and useful living material. The ancients, pondering this thought, decided that they rather liked the idea, that this was the explanation to things. It seemed to answer a great many questions. And on this basis, they brought up something a long time ago, which we are just beginning to get around to. Namely, the possibility that this process going on in the atmosphere of the earth has limitation. That you can go so far with it, and then, if your pollution becomes too great, you pollute your clarifying or cleansing medium itself. Water, by medieval analysis, would take a certain amount of refuse into itself and remain essentially pure. By that we mean that flowing water under light and the various natural circumstances of aeration and so forth could keep the water relatively pure, and that this water could then be used by human life without unusual danger. If, however, the amount of pollution was too great, then the water itself became polluted and was dangerous to human life. The same thing could conceivably happen to the atmosphere, especially when it was put under a strain for which it was not originally intended. Man, in the gradual development and involvement of his own way of life, has created situations which are not natural. And these situations, as they become more and more common, and man's endless ingenuity proceeds to exaggerate the difficulties rather than correcting them, might well result in a pattern perhaps similar to that of our smog disturbance here in Southern California, in which it seems as though, by conditions or by circumstances, we are unable to keep our air pure. This may be due to local conditions. It may be due, as in this case, principally to a formation within the area, by means of which we are not able to get sufficient atmospheric ventilation. Now, back at the Sorbonne and the Sapienza, early scientists working with this situation long before our modern way of life became as complicated as it is today, made a discovery which perhaps was in the right direction. They pointed out that there were very seldom serious epidemics of disease when there were high winds. That nearly always a serious epidemic breaking out in Europe was preceded by a long calmness of the air. That for several days there would be no wind at all, or very little. And in that time, the area would be more subject to this health problem. Whereas in an epidemic-ridden area, the rise of a strong and prevailing wind often resulted in the diminishing of the ailment. They came, therefore, to the conclusion that due to local conditions or to generally pervading conditions, that wind was an agent of cleansing by creating circulation which carried poisonous materials to remote parts of the atmosphere where they might be more easily destroyed, whereas lack of wind caused these poisons to remain in an area, and that these poisons, continuing to feed the area and not be dissipated, would in turn be re-inhaled into the body of the individual who lived there, creating a vicious circle, reducing resistance, and opening him, quite probably, to the inroad of sickness. Thus, the astrometeorological phase of the problem was partly due to the position of planets and the effect of these upon prevailing wind, whereas the wind itself, it did not seem to make so much difference which way it blew. As long as it was brisk, it would carry these ailments, these elements, break them down into such minute particles that they were not too dangerous, and carry them off into higher atmospheric strata. Also, the problem came as to weight of atmosphere, because it was essential to survival that impurity should rise as far from the surface of the earth as possible, being thereby carried so far into rarefied atmosphere that the sun's power to sterilize would be constantly more available. They then came to the conclusion that where atmosphere became heavy, close to the surface of the earth, and that this heaviness was accompanied by fogs, mist, or long periods of cloudiness, that the sterilizing power of the sun's ray was retarded, and that the ability of the sun to purify was thereby delayed or reduced, perhaps almost imperceptibly, but enough in the pattern of life to cause the derangement which made the continuance of the ailment possible. Now, in some ailments, such as, for example, cholera, we come to another interesting thing. Researchers in an early time report, among other things, a European on a ship sailing in one of the tropical seas. He actually claims that he and other members of the ship's crew, in fact the whole crew, actually saw a cholera cloud. And in Asiatic people, we find frequent references to this. And in some countries, as a danger warning against this epidemic, a piece of raw meat is suspended somewhere out of doors. If the cholera comes into the area, this raw meat immediately putrefies in a peculiar way. That something, therefore, is carried. That this epidemic has been pronounced visible as a kind of a miasma, or a kind of a fog-like situation, which either carries it or is essential to its presence in a particular area. This opens another field of possible thinking, whether perhaps we are dealing with a broad kind of atmospheric phenomena, and that these epidemics actually result from pollution, total pollution of nature, moving back upon the earth again, turned by certain type of atmospheric barrier, due in turn to some form of planetary activity. The answer would be planetary if it can be proven that the Farmer's Almanac is correct. And we have no proof that it is not. Certainly it is something worth considering. Now, presuming for a moment that there is some truth in this, we can then turn to research that has been done in the field of astrological thinking over a period of probably 3,000 or more years. For early in the beginnings of this art, it was strongly divided into what were called genelithaical astrology, or nativities of persons, and mundane astrology, which had to do with all the problems of the world, particularly problems involving nations, national relationships, health, weather, climate, and so forth. The old shipmaster would not go to sea without a study of the motions of planets, which would be likely to be effective during his voyage. And when we realize the type of ship he sailed in, and the long and hazardous journeys that he made, and the remarkable number of times in which he returned, it is evident that he must have had some rather greater skill than we have, for we would hesitate to make a small lake journey on a boat with which he was forced to go around the world. Therefore, his skill and his intimate knowledge of nature were his saving graces in most cases. If then there is such a problem, what seems to produce it? So, a number of instances, probably 400 or 500 cases of plague. Not cases involving individuals, but cases involving the date of the return of great epidemical diseases, the seasonal returns of children's diseases, and all of these things have been examined, broken down, and analyzed. Now we know, for example, that up to very recently, we were without the knowledge of 3 planets that we have since found and added to the solar family. Therefore, many of the earlier researches have to be revised in terms of the knowledge of Uranus, Neptune, and now Pluto. But even without these, the ancient was remarkably able to announce and foretell the advent of plagues and of various sicknesses, and also of determining the critical period of sickness in the life of an individual who was stricken. He was very capable of using this knowledge in diagnosis, and his patients survived in some miraculous manner, perhaps almost as well, if not entirely as well, as many of those of today. Out of this thinking, the ancient came to the opinion that Saturn and Mars had a particular relationship to epidemical disease, that these two constituted the ancient killers, and that Jupiter became involved to the degree that he represented mass, multitude, number. Whatever happened under the influence of Jupiter became increasingly expansive and had a large area or theater of action. Therefore, if Saturn and Mars were in evil association with each other, and Jupiter became involved in this pattern, something of an epidemical or grand nature might be regarded as likely. Now these same calculations have been revised with the addition of Uranus and Neptune. As up to now, not much has been done in such detail with the recent planet Lowell Pluto. But the other two have been considered, and they are found to combine very strongly with Mars and Saturn, so that we have 4 great planetary masses: Uranus, Neptune, Saturn, and Mars. And all of these have a very definite bearing upon certain periodic recurrences in atmospheric conditions. Now, the relationships of these to atmosphere must also be regarded as adding other factors to the pattern. And the old astrologer, looking into this, came to the conclusion that man is subject to many epidemical ailments other than those which can be physically diagnosed. that just as surely as he can have the whooping cough or the measles, so he can have a series of humors, or he can develop attitudes. The ancients did not have our modern psychological terminology, but what they are telling us is that various attitudes, individual and collective, can be due to these things. And that such an attitude, as we will say, as a recession, which we are beginning to speculate on at the moment, can also be due to great numbers of persons under certain debility of vitality. And that wherever individuals lose a certain measure of energy, they begin to think negatively. And whatever problem is besetting them at the moment, the problem becomes bigger as they feel less well. Whereas healthy persons, by nature optimistic, will attack a problem. Less healthy persons, not so optimistic, will permit the problem to attack them, and as a result come into serious trouble. Also, that under certain types of energy, particularly the energy of Uranus, individuals function under extraordinary tension. That instead of doing things in a relaxed and natural manner, they become stress-ridden. That it seems as though some kind of an irritating electrical current was coursing through them, which will never let them rest, will never let them do anything in an easy manner. And even when they have nothing to do particularly, still they cannot let down. They are under this constant urge. And our ancient brethren were of the opinion that this urge is due to certain electrical currents, and that humanity divides into several groups. One group is composed of persons comparatively immune to this urge because it does not have chemical or psychochemical affinity to them. This urge can move through a group of persons, but there are always some who will not respond because their own polarities will not respond. The individuality of the person is sufficiently strong to prevent response. The magnetic field of the individual does not chemically react to the magnetic influences in the same way because of a different basic polarization. Like the case of a radio that is turned on to a certain station, other programs will not be received by that adjustment. And the individual, having a certain adjustment, tunes in certain things. And in that way, those listening to that program will be affected by it. Others will not, perhaps except indirectly. So this pressure moving through space will, however, catch on to a great number of persons, producing a sufficient response to upset an economic situation or to drive a highly tense people into a state of war. It can mean that under this pressure, certain vitalities are inhibited, certain judgment is reduced, irritation is increased, and a group of persons who might otherwise be quiet and law-abiding citizens suddenly become a mass of irritated individuals. And with irritation present, there is always something that we can find to be an object for that irritation. And this in turn can result in marked rises in death rates, marked lowering of birth rate, marked increase in divorce, marked increase in crime, marked increase in alcoholism, and all of the various escape mechanisms which become operative under the pressure of a general situation. Now, whether the individual is going to react or not, and the degree of his reaction may be determined by his own nature, And the older people believed that therefore, if it was not adjusted to him by his own nature, the effect would not be felt. Therefore his own stars had to be examined also to determine whether he was sensitive to this condition. But that there would be enough persons sensitive to a broad situation, that by its stimulation, world patterns could change, world situations could change, and therefore that to a measure world health would be affected. The ancient was fully aware that there had to be a sound mind in a sound body in order for health to follow. If the body was corrupted, it was a disaster. If the mind in the body was corrupted, it was a greater disaster. But that you are either healthy or you are sick. And that where you are sick, the sickness is either due to your attitude or to conditions affecting your body. That your attitude may also affect your body. But the body, being composed of material elements, was also under the domination of certain material forces operating constantly in the universe. Thus a philosophy was gradually developed, integrated and pointed. And from this philosophy a number of rather interesting and relevant points can be gathered. One of these, perhaps the most general one, is paralleling the idea that Plato had, that the world itself was subject to alternate periods of fertility and sterility. We know that throughout history, world activities and events break into patterns, that these patterns are bounded by years, that one generation is given to arts and another to sciences, that at one time man develops tremendous ingenuity in music, and in another time, as now, he is immersed in electronics. Different eras, different patterns seem to lead, direct his interest, and through this leadership affect his world. Man, by nature an extremist, however, nearly always gets into trouble with his own inventions. He is unable to be moderate, and he is not sufficiently broad in his understanding to consider the secondary consequences of the things he does. He feels that he will accomplish a certain thing, but he does not know how to get away from the inevitable negative misuse of that which he accomplishes. So every blessing has a curse within it, and every curse may be a blessing in disguise. These things are polarized. And the individual, creating a new life pattern, brings himself inevitably under both the positive and negative aspects of that pattern. The positive aspects are progress, and for the most part, the negative aspects are sickness. Under the existing world shape of things now, we perceive a strong increase in epidemical disease. We observe a strong increase in that great disease, tension. We are using every means possible to fight this tension ailment. And we are going back to Hippocrates, who insisted that the intensities of man afflicted his flesh, and that he cannot live badly inside and have a healthy external life. Now, when you start to work with people, however, who have these intensities, you come upon a very interesting thing that is as mysterious as weather. And that mystery is their own climate. The individual, for the most part, lives in a kind of way of life that no matter how unsatisfactory it may be, he loves it devoutly. No matter how much misery it has caused him, he has little, if any, inclination to change. Always he is confronted with a twofold path, what he should do and what he wants to do. And in 99 cases out of 100, he will assume that what he wants to do is inevitable. and therefore that there is no use resisting in any way. Even the thought of resistance begins to convey the impulse of arduous effort, and that in itself is paralyzing. Man with a tremendous capacity to work hard doing nothing can find little, if any, energy to work slightly doing something. He considers all self-improvement labor, whereas the performance of those things that make him sick, this is a real joy, a real self-expression. He also feels that he is a human being with an inalienable right to do what he pleases, even though the result pleases no one. It is this strange apathy which leaves the person with no probability of reform except some kind of a change in his own climate. He has to have a different degree of humidity in order to combat the degree of stupidity with which he is afflicted. And this change, when it does come, is like the departure of an epidemic. No one seems to know why it goes any more than why it came. The individual will occasionally wake up in the morning and decide to live a different kind of life and go and do it. But you cannot directly trace this in the majority of instances to anyone's influence on him. Perhaps he has been collectively exposed to something and has come to like it. But why one morning he gets up and does it, no one seems to know. Why another person in an equally difficult situation will never do anything about it is also equally a mystery of life. Out of this situation, however, that no one really wishes to curb himself, limit his own pleasures, or protect the common good at his own expense. While this goes on, we have situations collectively such as the Southern California smog. We also have situations in which a similar kind of smog affected a number of villages in France. And probably most of you are aware that one of these curious village problems, one in France and one in Belgium, resulted in a very sharp loss of life. A kind of miasma settled over the area. It was preceded, by the way, by a long period of calm without wind. And it seems that whenever this calmness became too extended in the area, there was danger. By a parallel, it has been noted that long periods without rain in areas where rain is normally abundant frequently announce an earthquake. Therefore, certain magnetic fields are grounded by rain. And wherever we come into a difficult situation, we are often likely to find drought or lack of water. On the other hand, there are certain ailments that are the deadly enemy of rain, and rain is their greatest friend in perpetuating themselves. This means that there is more than one such atmospheric phenomenal ailment, and there is undoubtedly a kind of ailment that is rooted in any unusual type of natural phenomenon. In other words, as Hippocrates and Galen both pointed out, the normalcy of man is rooted in the normalcy of nature. And whenever nature becomes disturbed, man must inevitably also be disturbed. So health arises from a normalcy of things. And the great protection that man can create is a protection of normalcy within and around himself, especially when he is in the presence of any abnormal situation arising in nature. Thus, floods and disasters in nature will create abnormal situations which almost immediately increase the death rate of human beings. And wherever we find a natural catastrophe, we know that we must move in immediately with sanitation and medicine, or this natural catastrophe will be followed by a human disaster. This way we can begin to see that man's state is to a measure due to his reaction to natural situation. The purpose of man's mind and his emotional and rational and spiritual content is that man shall learn how to know nature, obey nature, protect himself from negative aspects of nature, and help nature to strengthen her own defenses on all levels of knowledge. Man, however, is not a philanthropist of this kind. It hasn't occurred to him that nature needs him. Rather, he assumes that nature is a great area waiting to be exploited by him. This situation has led to a great deal of complication. Certain very common problems that we suffered from have been brought under fair control. Although if this control was relaxed, we would soon be in difficulty again. They say that if the various medical regulations at our ports of entrance to our country were removed, that in 30 days the bubonic plague would be in America. We have to guard ourselves and watch our ways constantly. At the same time, we are vulnerable now on an entirely different level. And today we are creating new ailments. Ailments have a relation to time and place. We speak constantly of industrial ailments, of vocational ailments. And we also know that any condition in which a collective people involves itself can and will produce health problems. A totally new way of life, then, might bring with it a totally new structure of disease. And any change within a large pattern may result in a modification or an exaggeration of the aspects and symptoms of various existing ailments. We know that for many centuries peoples were completely clear of many diseases, and that the Western Hemisphere was without some of the diseases that we have until Western migration. But these ancient peoples also had their own ailments, and they had their parallels. An epidemic striking in Europe could not directly reach America before the colonization plan began, when they were separated by an uncrossed ocean, and no one even knew the existence of the Western Hemisphere. There was certainly no communication by means of which disease could be carried. Yet epidemics in Europe and Asia, reported in the chronicles of Mexico by the Aztecs and Mayas, prove that these epidemics existed in both hemispheres, meaning that there had to be some cause beyond direct contagion. Also, the timing indicates that the mere problem of sanitation would not answer. The one thing that the two hemispheres had in common was air, atmosphere, and also the conditioning situations arising in air due to storms and droughts and similar phenomena. Thus that these phenomena in turn are caused by the heavy combinations of planets would indicate that we might expect to be able to predict or foreknow those areas of danger from a health standpoint before the condition arises. We would also have available to us the kind of information that might help in the reduction of smog, inasmuch as we could determine those periods with reasonable accuracy in which the danger would be the greatest. We could also perhaps learn more about this cleansing process of upper atmosphere. We could perhaps rearrange some of our industries in such a manner that their chemical residue would be different. And being different would again perhaps break the spell of which sameness is a requisite. Many things could be done to improve our health and many of our problems if we would get beyond ourselves and begin to think of our citizenship in a total world. If we can learn to understand the degree in which the atmosphere of various areas with different surface conditions, different magnetic fields operating, we can learn the different degrees in which these areas can absorb, we could perhaps place many of our essential and necessary industries in areas where this absorption is the greatest, and where therefore there would be the least probability of dangerous results. We also might be able to screen out more effectively the dangerous elements so that they would not require such a heavy absorption by the atmosphere itself. Man today has increased upon the surface of the earth far beyond the ancient world, and today the rate of population increase is expected to so rapidly multiply that within 100 or 200 years at the most we may have double the present population of the earth. This doubled population can only survive by the doubling of industries, by the gradual intensifying of life, and by perhaps the gradual destruction of more and more of our natural resources. More and more of our land is being destroyed in terms of alchemy. The balance of relationship between earth and atmosphere is being constantly changed. And there have been considerable speculation as to the effect of Lake Mead upon the climate of California, an artificial lake created, and the marked change in climate as a result. Artificial deserts have been created by paving huge cities with concrete. Artificial hazards are caused by cutting down of vegetation and by the carelessness which has destroyed so much of our land from the standpoint of our watersheds, especially fire. All these things affect the total life of the individual. And in this picture of a total effect, we find that periodically a situation is created which permits the emergence or the coming into total manifestation of certain corruptions. These, whether we wish to regard them as germs which suddenly gain authority and weaken structure, whether we wish to believe, as some of the ancients did, that a virus is a peculiar type of psychic organism, we can't see it, we can't get it with a filter, that this psychic organism is a byproduct of the waste of human emotion and thought. Whatever we wish to assume, we do know that when we're naughty, we do not feel good. And that the great remedy seems to be to build a reasonable, rational, common sense way of life, expecting to work with nature instead of sitting back and doing as we please forever. If through intelligent situation we learn the capacities and limitations of our earth, we can probably adjust ourselves with a maximum of integrity and a minimum of disaster. If, however, we continue to think that we live in an absolutely limitless earth, that we can do as we please forever, we will undoubtedly come to great grief. We have got to understand and cooperate with nature in the creation of the chemical situations which she needs for survival. Through cooperation, we can not only improve our physical life, but because of the relation of the psychic atmosphere upon our disposition, we can probably solve a great many of our emotional and stress problems. And out in the sky, these great planets, forming their conjunctions and squares and oppositions, coming into very definite patterns, are associated with extraordinary climatic situations, and these in turn are followed almost immediately by forms of disease. In some instances, the aspects are such that the physical changes are not obvious, and only the psychological changes are noticed. But then we have another situation. From the psychological changes, we get a reaction into physical situations, perhaps leading to war and crime. We should understand the world in order to understand how to live in it. And while we are concerned with every kind of knowledge you can imagine, it might be well to turn our attention to that form of knowledge which bears directly upon our daily living, and begin to plan a cooperative, constructive partnership with nature through an understanding of her laws and a gentle determination to obey them. Time's up. Now I'd like to call your attention to the subject for next Sunday morning, which is a long way from this one, but might have some relationship. How far can we trust ourselves and others? Now everyone will have something to think about in connection with trusting people. Most folks are a little disillusioned, particularly as to trusting others. But it may also be well to examine our own relationship to this pattern of trustworthiness. Are we to be trusted any better than other people? Why are we not? What is there in us which detracts from trustworthiness, makes it difficult for us to keep our word, or to fulfill our obligation, or to meet an emergency with a reasonable degree of dignity? So we think that next Sunday we will have something for those persons who are in danger of being disillusioned, who have been disillusioned, or who wish to prevent themselves from being in a spot where they can be disillusioned. And I do not mean by that the answer to this problem is any kind of a grand statement, do not trust anybody. That is not the answer. We can't tell you the answer now, but we'll tell you that is not it. I'd like to also in connection with the morning, suggest our little booklet, Philosophy of Astrology, which I think you may find helpful, relating to these large universal motions and the concept of the ancient concerning the world in which we live. Also, perhaps this morning, Philosophy for the Sick would be helpful, or 10 Rules for Better Living, and our book on the occult anatomy of man, and our book on man, all dealing with health problems, physical situations, and how the individual can philosophically assist himself to keep well. So we hope you will find all these themes interesting, and we certainly hope to see you next Sunday morning, and we hope you will be sufficiently trustworthy to be here.